This is Rummy's Corner. Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back to the latest installment of the Top 10 by Decade scoring experiment. In part 1, we started with the heavyweight division, and we have worked our way down from there, going through the cruiserweights, the light heavyweights, the super middleweights, the middleweights, and today in part 6, it's the junior middleweight division. Once again, we will be utilizing Ring Magazine's rich archive of historical rankings in order to try and objectively determine the top 10 junior middleweight boxers from each decade. Unfortunately, our data set is a real mess here. Ring Magazine began doing annual rankings for the junior middleweight division in 1974, and they continued doing so until 1986. Then they discontinued the practice of ranking junior middleweights until they resumed doing so in 1989. In previous installments, we have been beginning from the first complete decade of data, which would have been normally the 1990s here. But I figured there's no harm in doing partial decades, so going forward, we will include partial decades, and ultimately, I will double back to cover stuff from the 1920s and the other notable missing partial division, which was the 1980s cruiserweights. So I will double back to those eventually. At the conclusion of 1974, these were the top-rated junior middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Oscar Alvarado was champion, so he will receive 10 points for being the first name on the list. Next on the list is 9 points for Alicia Obed, and we continue scoring points in this fashion until we get to the 10th name on the list, Donato Paduano, and he gets 1 point. Note that Miguel Angel Castellini is the 11th name on the list, and he doesn't get any points. We're only concerned with the top 10 names on any given list. If we go ahead and do this for every year from 1974 through 1979, our final result for the partial decade looks like this. Maurice Hope topped the list with 35 points. He was consistently viewed as one of the best, despite never having been viewed as the best in the class. And if you look at the numbers, nobody was ever considered the best for more than 1 year. Moving on to the 1980s, we have a 2-year gap in our data here. We have nothing for 1987 or 1988. With the information we do have available, Tommy Hearns finished first with 40 points. He was viewed as the best of the class for 4 consecutive years. Guys like Mike McCallum, John Mugabe, Julian Jackson, and a few others, they may have scored higher if we had data from 1987 and 1988. That's one of the reasons I was initially reluctant to include partial decades to begin with, because we don't have a complete picture. But given this system was something that was never perfect to begin with, why not see what we have? Looking ahead to the 1990s, this is our first complete decade for rankings, and Terry Norris finished first with an impressive 72-point total. Norris was consistently viewed among the very best at 154 throughout the 90s, and not without good reason. Julio Cesar Vasquez had an impressive 52-point score. Head-to-head, Vasquez and Norris both lost against Laurent Boudouani, and I say this just to remind everyone that this isn't about head-to-head considerations. This scoring system is more about being considered among the best in a given weight class over the course of a single decade. On to the double O's, there was very little separating the top 3 guys. Fernando Vargas finished first with 44, then it was Winky Wright with 43, and Oscar De La Hoya with 42. Vargas topped the list despite never being considered the best at the conclusion of any of these years. Looking at this list, as I'm remembering, not too many of these guys were at the weight class throughout the decade. A lot of them were spending a good deal of time either at 147 and or 160, in addition to 154. There was some decent talent passing through the division at this time, but not many of them really ever called the division home. And now, even though the current decade is yet another incomplete decade, through the end of 2017, the current list looks like this. Arislandi Lara has an impressive 57-point total. Right behind him, tied for second, we have Cotto and Canelo, both with 47 points. Mathematically, a few of these guys could pass Lara, but that doesn't strike me as something that's very likely when looking at the names that can still mathematically catch him. But nothing is complete here, so we will just have to wait and see how things play out. As far as junior middleweights who finished top 10 in multiple decades, there are 4 names here, but Ayub Kaluli and Maurice Hope both competed in decades that each have incomplete data sets. And then we have Winky Wright and Verno Phillips, who appeared in both the 90s and the double O's. Regarding the most dominant decade as a junior middleweight, top on the list is Terry Norris from the 1990s. Then we actually have Arislandi Lara from the current decade, Vasquez from the 90s is next, and then Canelo and Cotto tied from the current decade. And then we have the close scores from the guys from the double O's, De La Hoya, Winky, and Vargas. And just looking at this list, when thinking of dominant decades from previous installments, you can tell this division lacks the rich history of middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. I mean, obviously that could be said of all of the newer weight classes. There's just not a whole lot of history and tradition here. Now, if we add up all of the numbers from junior middleweights who finished top 10 in any of these decades, including the partials, our final result looks like this. Terry Norris is first with 72 points. Next up is Winky, and then Lara, and most of the names on the upper half of this list are guys who did spend considerable time in the weight class, whereas other guys like Tommy Hearns, Oscar De La Hoya, Felix Trinidad, Shane Mosley, and even Floyd Mayweather Jr., those guys tended to pass through this division without spending considerable time competing there. So in that context, this list makes sense to me, because guys like Terry Norris and Winky Wright, they did spend quite a lot of time competing at the highest level at 154. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Please stay tuned for part 7 of the Top 10 by Decade series. Next up, the welterweight division. Until then, have a great night, everyone.